In my paper, I set out to research a topic that is only briefly mentioned in the source related to environmentalism in Slovakia, and that is international contact between Slovak environmentalists represented by the most active group in Slovakia's capital Bratislava and their counterparts in Western and Eastern Europe. Even though the heyday of such contacts in the sphere of environmental NGOs came shortly after the Velvet Revolution, Slovak environmentalists established various links even before, in the second half of the 1980s. So the organizations of which I'm going to speak have roots in the 1950s. Its predecessors were youth nature camps, student conservation societies, and nature brigades. Such organizations were especially popular in Western Europe and Scandinavia. Their activities mostly consisted of field biology and environmental education, and these camps led to international camps, which brought together these like-minded individuals, and in 1956, the International Youth Federation was created. Czechoslovakia took first tentative steps towards cooperation with International Youth Federation in the 1960s. And you can see in the upper right corner, there's a photograph of people sitting together. And it's quite special because it was taken during an international camp that was held in Czechoslovakia in 1968. And the photo was taken just a few minutes after the participants were told that Czechoslovakia was invaded by the armies of the Warsaw Pact. Why the cooperation was established in the 1980s? In Western Europe, environmentalism flourished as environmental NGOs expanded. The debate shifted away from overpopulation and resource depletion to issues such as air, water, and soil pollution, and of course, nuclear energy. IYF had become by that time so large that in the 1980s, Youth and Environment Europe was formed by environmental activists in Belgium, Sweden, and Denmark. They continued to organize nature camps, now less about field biology and more about training and campaigning. And after that, European Youth Forest Action was established in the Netherlands, which focused specifically on acid rain, which caused great damage to Europe's forests, and it was especially prevalent in the 1980s. And AFA became the leading organization in reaching out to Eastern Europe and specifically to Czechoslovakia. So meanwhile, in Czechoslovakia, the Brontosaurus movement was established in 1974, an official socialist union of youth initiative aimed at environmental activities. It became very popular as thousands of volunteers practiced conservation work at historical sites and so on. In Slovakia, the leading force in environmentalism was the Slovak Union of Nature and Landscape Protectors, which is also an official state organization with a hierarchical structure. And also a similar organization to the Czech Brontosaurus was the Slovak Strom života, or the Tree of Life, which organized similar camps. So in the upcoming years, Brontosaurus managed to forge ties with both Youth and Environment Europe and European Youth Forest Action. They also met at international camps, the first of which was held in Czechoslovakia in 1976. And with regards to Eastern Europe, these Western NGOs mostly had the same goals, and that was disseminating and exchanging information, organizing action campaigns, and training camps for people from Eastern Europe. They also went on bus tours to Eastern Europe and met with local environmentalists. So interactions between Slovak environmentalists and environmental movements in other countries, in other socialist countries. Naturally, of course, the Slovak environmentalists had the closest contacts with their Czech counterparts, whether it was the Czech Union of Nature Protectors, the Brontosaurus movement, or the ecology section of the Biological Society of the Czechoslovak Academy of Sciences. Many international contacts were established via the Czechs. Then most of the interactions between Slovakia, Hungary, and Austria in the sphere of environmentalism was centered around the river Danube. So after the Gabčíkovo-Nadmaroš Treaty was signed in the late 70s, where it was agreed that the a joint hydroelectric dam was going to be built on Danube. Slovak environmentalists protested against the project, but they recommended carrying out the construction, but presented ideas to lessen the negative impact on nature and environment. They cooperated with Austrians, later with Hungarians. It's interesting that in the case of Gabčíkov and Nagymaros, the contacts were more intense with Austria than with Hungary. And also, in the late 1980s, they also reached out to their colleagues in the Ukraine, where in 1987, the Green World Association was founded. That was the first national environmental NGO in Ukraine. And they participated in protests in Kiev and visited each other's congresses and so on. So probably the only or the first effort of environmentalists in the socialist countries to create a sort of a transnational network that might enable environmental activists in Eastern Europe to communicate better was Greenway. It dates back to 1985. This was an organization that was based in Hungary, and it was a collective initiative of various groups. One of them was the European Youth Forest Action. The other was the Hungarian ELTE Club, the Polish Polski Klub Ekologiczny, and the aforementioned Brontosaurus, and some representatives from the Slovak Union of Nature Protectors. So Greenway was to serve as a communication center for East European environmentalists. Over the years, Greenway managed to connect Polish, Czechoslovak, Hungarian, Latvian, Lithuanian, and East German activists in various conferences, meetings, or seminars. So another part of my research was that I wanted to find out, explore whether the most influential environmental discourses also resonated among the Slovak environmentalists. So I found out they were very familiar with many concepts, the works of the Club of Rome and their reports, the concept of sustainable development from 1987, Ardennes's deep ecology, and also James Lovelock's Gaia theory, which was quite popular in the 1980s, and so on. Most of these books were published either as samizdats, or they were published, but only in a few copies, usually for a small audience in academies of sciences. So to sum up, though environmental contacts between the East and the West reached their peak in the 1980s, Slovak environmentalists were largely unprepared for such activities. Only the Bratislava movement had both the organizational skills and capacity to take part in them. Many of the local environmentalists closely followed global environmental discourse and recognized the potential of international networking. When West European NGOs received much recognition and could influence government policies and actively lead campaigns against pollution, East European environmentalists battled with institutional pressure from the state authorities. Regardless of the fact that international contacts brought much inspiration and new knowledge, a sense of disconnection from the rest of the world lingered. One of the reasons why closer integration between environmental movements and socialist states hadn't been achieved was the diversity of political regimes. The Eastern Bloc was not a monolith, and each state had a different degree of sensitivity with regards to environmentalism. So Hungarian environmentalists managed to set up the headquarters of the only organization in Eastern Europe that aspired to create a transnational network across socialist states. And at the same time, their counterparts in East Germany and Czechoslovakia were being investigated for revealing the real state of the environment, and keeping in touch with foreign NGOs was considered suspicious. Moreover, even on the national level, environmental groups were often atomized or reluctant to integrate further. The Brontosaurus movement, with its mass popularity and regular meetings, was one of the well-organized groups. In Slovakia, the Bratislava environmentalists functioned very effectively on local level, but on the national level, there was not much cooperation. Many showed little interest in international activities, a fact perhaps connected to another problem, the language barrier. So to speak English or German, well, in the 1980s, Czechoslovakia was more an exception than a rule, especially in situations which required specialized vocabulary. And furthermore, such activities were dependent on funding, and even the Dutch environmentalists sometimes grappled with the lack of resources. So to sum it up somehow, the Slovak environmental movement itself is a largely unexplored topic. Further research needs to be done to inquire into the movement's origins, motivations, and values. The same is true of international environmental transfers, of which only very little is known so far. And this paper, I hope, should serve as incentive for further study. So I think it's needed to fully comprehend where the Slovak environmental movement stands in the context of Eastern and Western environmentalism. So I think that's it for me.